He thought he was buying a cow, but what he really bought was a life he couldn't walk away from. This is the story of how a poor rancher met the strangest bride this side of the Mississippi, and how, on the very first night, she locked the door and changed everything. Before we dive in, make sure you watch till the end, because what she does on the final night will leave you speechless. And if you love dark Western stories with mystery, subscribe for more tales from the frontier. The land was bone dry. Winds howled through the broken fences, carrying the scent of dust and dead grass. It hadn't rained in weeks, maybe months. And on the edge of that parched nowhere, a weary rancher named Eli sat on the porch of his sagging home, staring out at 3 dead calves and an empty water trough. His boots were worn thin, his shirt stuck to his back with sweat, and the last coins in his tin jar had already been spent on beans and hope. Eli wasn't a bad man, just a tired one. The kind the West forgot, too honest to steal, too proud to beg. He needed a miracle, or at least a cow that could give milk before winter hit. So he posted signs in town, offering what little he had left in trade: 2 acres of barren land, an old revolver, and quietly, without writing it, his own willingness to marry if it meant survival. 4 days later she arrived. She came at sunset, riding in a creaky wagon pulled by a gray mule. The townsfolk turned to stare. She was big, not just tall but wide in the hips and shoulders, with a long dark braid hanging over one side like a coiled rope. A broad hat shaded most of her face. She led a healthy, fat dairy cow, and said nothing until she stood in front of Eli. "Marry me," she said, voice low and hoarse. "The cow's yours after the vows. No name. No history. Just a trade." The town laughed behind cupped hands. "He's marrying a cow for a cow," someone whispered outside the courthouse as they signed the papers. Eli didn't look up. He didn't care. He was broke, and the cow had the fattest udders he'd seen in years. The wedding was over before sundown. No guests, no preacher, just a courthouse clerk and a dry signature. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the cow trailing behind like it already belonged. That night, as Eli walked toward the bedroom with quiet, cautious steps, she turned without a word, stepped inside, and locked the door from within. He stood there a long moment, staring at the brass handle, unsure who had really just moved in. Eli woke the next morning to the smell of eggs, bacon, and fresh cornbread, a luxury he hadn't tasted in weeks. Sunlight streamed through the cracked windows, catching motes of dust as they floated in the still air of the farmhouse. He pulled on his boots slowly, half wondering if the night before had been a fever dream. But when he stepped into the kitchen, there she was. She moved with strange confidence, her broad back to him as she stirred the skillet. No greetings, no morning pleasantries. Just a plate set on the table, already steaming. Without asking, she poured his coffee and slid the plate across. "Eat," she said, then added, "You'll need strength to fix the east fence. It's ours now after all." Ours. The word caught him off guard. She said it without hesitation, as though she'd been living there all along. Eli looked at her, really looked this time, not at her size, which folks in town had joked about, but at the certainty in her movements. She didn't ask where the flour was or which shelf held the spoons. She moved like a woman who already knew. As the day stretched on, that unsettling familiarity only deepened. She directed him toward the shed without needing to ask where it stood. When a tool broke, she reached into the crate before he could, pulling out a spare handle that even Eli had forgotten existed. In the barn, she unhooked ropes, refilled troughs, and even guided the cow into a new pen like she'd done it 100 times before. He watched her from behind bales of hay, confused. Suspicious, even. That night, he climbed into the attic, the one space she hadn't touched. It was dusty and full of cobwebs, but he wasn't up there for repairs. He was looking for answers. And that's when he saw them. A pair of worn women's boots, size too large for anyone he knew, tucked neatly in a corner behind an old saddle. Next to them was a faded photograph in a cracked wooden frame. It showed a man, maybe Eli's grandfather, standing beside a woman who bore an eerie resemblance to the stranger now cooking in his kitchen. The photo was old, too old, and yet, something in her face, the sharpness of the jaw, the eyes, matched the woman downstairs. Eli felt the skin on his neck crawl. Was she a relative? A drifter who'd seen the place in a dream? Or was there something more tangled going on here, something older than memory? He didn't mention the photo. He didn't ask about the boots. At dinner, she served stew with thick chunks of beef, and her eyes didn't leave his face the entire time he chewed. Her gaze wasn't cruel or warm, just steady. Measured. Like she was studying a man-shaped puzzle and slowly slotting the pieces into place. That night, as the house quieted and the wind howled low outside, he paused by her door again. He didn't knock, just stood there, unsure of what he wanted. maybe to talk, maybe to ask who she really was. But before he could speak, her voice slipped through the crack in the wood, barely above a whisper. You'll understand by winter. It wasn't a threat. Not a promise either. It was something colder. Something rooted in knowing. Eli didn't sleep much that night. The blankets were warm, but his mind stayed chilled. There was something about her that didn't make sense, and yet, it wasn't fear that filled him. It was something deeper. Like a man staring at a cliffside, unable to tell if it was crumbling beneath his feet, or if he'd already jumped. The next morning she was already outside, feeding the mule. She waved without looking back and shouted, "East fence still needs patching." And just like that she disappeared behind the barn. Like she belonged. Like she always had. Eli stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching her figure vanish into the morning fog. The cow chewed lazily beside her. The land, though dry and cracked, looked a little less lonely than it had before. But deep in his chest Eli knew something had shifted. This wasn't just a strange woman with a cow. This wasn't a marriage of desperation. This was something else entirely. The storm rolled in after sundown, drenching the horizon in deep purple and flashes of gold lightning. The air was heavy, charged with a weight Eli couldn't quite explain. Rain had finally come, but it didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like something being unearthed. Inside the house, the walls groaned with the wind, and loose shutters banged like gunfire against the boards. Eli tossed in bed, unable to sleep, until a sound cut through the thunder, a sound no storm could explain. It was crying. Not the wind. Not the mule. But a low, muffled sob coming from the barn. He grabbed his lantern and coat and stepped out into the night, boots sinking into wet earth as he crossed the yard. The barn loomed like a black skeleton against the sky. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay, old wood, and something older. The sobbing had stopped by the time he reached the doors, but the silence inside was somehow louder. He searched the stalls, calling out her name, but got no answer. Then he climbed to the hayloft, the wooden ladder creaking beneath his weight. That's when he saw it. A torn piece of white fabric, half buried in the hay. He pulled it free, shaking off bits of straw, and felt his chest tighten. It was a wedding veil. The lace was delicate, yellowed with time, but unmistakably bridal. One side had been ripped, as if torn away in haste or violence. Nearby, tucked in a corner, was a rusty hairpin, still clinging to a strand of black hair. He descended the ladder with the veil clutched in his fist, heart pounding. This wasn't hers, at least not the one she'd worn the day they signed the papers. That veil had been plain. This one was older, finer. It carried a story. The next morning, after pretending all was normal, Eli rode into town under the excuse of getting nails and supplies. But his real destination was a quiet cottage at the edge of the cemetery, where an old priest named Father Harlan lived, long retired and half forgotten. Harlan had buried most of the town's sinners and remembered their sins well. Eli didn't even have to mention her name. He barely got the words out, a tall woman, strong-built, dark braid, before the priest sighed and leaned back. She came through years ago, Harlan said, voice raspy like dry paper. Married a man who ran cattle near Pine Ridge. Big cruel bastard. No one ever saw him again after the first winter. Did she kill him? Eli asked quietly. The priest just shook his head. Maybe. Or maybe she ran because he nearly killed her. Either way, she didn't cry at his funeral. Because there wasn't one. Eli rode home under a sky that had already cleared, but the storm had sunk into his bones. That night he kept his distance. Watched her from the kitchen doorway as she carved dried apples into slices, humming some low melody that didn't sound like anything from around these parts. In the days that followed, Eli noticed more strange behavior. She spent long stretches alone near the south fence, drawing with a stick in the dirt. When he walked by, she would quickly wipe away the markings with her boot. But once, he caught a glimpse before she erased it. Twisted symbols, a pair of initials joined in a circle, and a strange shape like a broken heart mended with stitches. He finally confronted her one evening after dinner. The light was dying outside and the house felt colder than usual despite the fire. I found a veil, he said. In the hayloft. I know it wasn't yours. And the priest, he remembers you. He remembers your last husband. She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Just turned her head slowly and looked him dead in the eyes. Men take land, she said softly. I take it back. That was all. Eli stood in silence, unsure if she meant her words metaphorically, or literally. He didn't know if she'd killed the last man, or simply survived him. Didn't know if she had buried secrets beneath the barn floor or just deep within herself. But he couldn't ignore the pull anymore. There was something about her, something that twisted inside him. Part fear. Part fascination. Part something darker. He was drawn to her in the way a moth is drawn to fire. Not because it's safe, but because it burns different from anything else. He sat alone on the porch that night, staring into the dark with the cow sleeping soundly nearby. He thought about the land, about the deal he'd made, and about the woman inside who now moved through his home like it was always hers. And in that moment, Eli realized something unsettling. It wasn't just the cow he was stuck with anymore. The days rolled on with a rhythm that no longer felt like survival, it felt like structure. The kind of structure she brought with her the moment she stepped onto the land. Eli found himself watching more than working, quietly observing how she commanded space. She wasn't loud, never raised her voice, but every hand on the ranch began to move in time with her presence. The 2 young ranch hands he'd hired for the summer now waited for her word, not his, before loading feed or breaking a horse. She fixed the east fence without asking. Hauled the broken gate into place with her sleeves rolled and her boots sunk deep in the mud. She patched the roof of the chicken coop, stitched the feed sacks, calmed a spooked mule without a single whisper. Eli watched her from the porch, coffee in hand, and thought not for the first time, this woman doesn't just know how to survive out here. She's lived it. Alone. She never asked permission. She just did what needed doing and it started to feel right. Like she'd always been meant to be part of the place as much as the soil and wind itself. Then one evening something changed. The sun had long dipped behind the hills when Eli returned from the edge of the property, boots caked in dust, shoulders stiff. He reached for the bedroom door as he had every night since the wedding, out of habit more than hope. But this time his hand met air. The door was slightly ajar. No lock. No latch. No barrier. He stepped inside slowly, expecting, he didn't know what. A confrontation? A moment of vulnerability? Something romantic maybe, even if neither of them had spoken of love. But what he found was something else entirely. Laid out on the bed was a thick leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked, the edges weathered from travel. She wasn't inside the room. Just the journal, open to a page marked with a long black hair twisted into a loop. He sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to wrinkle the pages, and began to read. There were maps, sketched by hand, of small towns, trails, places he recognized and others he didn't. Scribbled notes beside each, too many eyes. Men with empty promises. Clerks who smiled too wide. Further in, the pages turned more personal. Memories written in blunt, unpoetic ink. Names of men. Dates. The terms of marriages, land exchanged, cows bartered. But not once, did she write about love. Only survival. Only reclamation. And then, halfway through the journal, a single line stopped him cold. Marriage isn't about hearts. It's about property. He sat back, journal resting on his knees. The weight of those words didn't feel cruel. Felt true. She hadn't tricked him. She hadn't pretended to offer something soft and warm. From the first moment, she'd made her offer plain. Marry me and the cow is yours. And now, through this journal, she'd made the rest clear too. She never wanted a man. She wanted land. A place. A name on paper. And yet Eli didn't feel betrayed. Somewhere along the way, the bitterness he should have felt never arrived. In its place was a strange sense of respect. Even admiration. Because while he'd spent months hoping for rain and luck, she had built a plan, slowly, deliberately, through dust and fire, and executed it without apology. That night, as the fire crackled low in the hearth, he found her outside on the back porch, staring out at the hills. She didn't flinch when he joined her. Didn't say a word. Just scooted over slightly, enough for him to sit beside her. They didn't speak for a long time. There were no confessions. No apologies. Just the sound of night creatures in the brush and the soft creak of the wooden boards beneath their feet. She passed him a tin cup of warm cider without looking his way. He took it, their fingers brushing just once, briefly, quietly. In that silence, something shifted. The distance between them didn't vanish, but it softened. Not lovers. Not exactly partners. But no longer strangers either. He glanced sideways at her, lit by moonlight and shadow, and thought, this is a new kind of bride. One who didn't bring love or lace. She brought grit, secrets, and strength he hadn't known he needed. She turned her head slightly and said only one thing before they both sat still again. Winter's coming. We'll see what survives. And in that moment, Eli knew she wasn't just talking about the ranch. By the time the first snows kissed the tops of the far hills, the ranch had changed. What had once been a dying patch of earth now pulsed with life. New fences, fatter livestock, the soft hum of routine. The cow she brought gave milk rich and steady, and even the mule walked with more purpose these days. Eli found himself waking earlier, working harder, not because he feared losing it all, but because for the first time in years he wanted to keep it. People in town no longer laughed behind his back. The whispers turned into nods, then into quiet respect. The same men who once called her the fat stranger, now tipped their hats when she walked past. She didn't smile at them, never had. But she didn't need to. Her presence was like iron in the soil. She belonged even if no one could quite say where she came from. Still, not everything was settled. There were nights she disappeared. Never with warning, never with lies. She'd simply not be in bed when Eli returned from the fields. The back door would creak shut sometime after midnight, and by morning she'd be in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, hair damp, frying eggs as if nothing had changed. He never asked. She never offered. But he noticed the way her eyes looked afterward, clearer sometimes, other times darker, as if she'd left pieces of herself out there in the fields. Then came the day he found her with the cow. The sky was pale and stretched thin, a quiet afternoon after days of snowmelt. Eli had wandered out behind the barn, following the low sounds of murmuring he thought might be the ranch hands. Instead, he found her standing alone in the pasture. Her hand rested on the cow's thick neck, fingers brushing the fur gently. Her braid hung loose. Her boots were half sunk in mud. She didn't see him right away. She was whispering, not to the cow exactly but into the open space between them. "You wanted her," she said softly. "But now I have you." Eli froze. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even possessive. It was something quieter. Like the final line of a contract being signed in breath, not ink. A deal that had taken on a life beyond what either of them had imagined. That night, back inside the house, he noticed something else. The bedroom door, the one that had once been locked tight night after night, was always open now. Had been for weeks. Maybe longer. He hadn't even realized when the change occurred. But there it was. No latch. No creak of hinges at midnight. No decisions being made for him. And yet he'd never left. He sat at the edge of the bed for a long while, staring at the doorway, listening to the wind dance along the edge of the window pane. There were no locks now. No barriers. But something stronger kept him there. The next morning, as the fire crackled and the ranch stirred to life, he finally asked what had been growing in his chest since the first time she set foot on his land. "Why me?" She didn't look up from the wood she was stacking. Just paused, wiped her hands on her apron and said, "Because you needed me." Then after a breath she added, "And I needed someone who'd stay, even when the door was open." There was nothing else to say. Nothing that needed explaining. It wasn't a love story, not the kind that came with flowers and soft words. It was a story about presence. About roots finding ground again after being torn out too many times. It was about two people who hadn't been looking for each other, but somehow still found what they needed. By spring the ranch looked almost new. Fences painted. Animals strong. The porch boards replaced and sanded smooth. But the biggest change wasn't in the land, it was in the quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask questions anymore. The kind that comes after storms, when nothing needs to be said to prove what's been weathered. And in that quiet, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, two figures sat side by side on the porch. They didn't touch. They didn't speak. But between them there were no chains. No locks. Just silence. And something that almost looked like peace.